Okay, quick show of hands for my viewership. How many of you have actually seen the movie Frankenstein? Anyone? Even though I can't actually see you right now, I would imagine that not a lot of you are raising your hands. Probably because you're sitting by yourself watching this and you would look kind of silly if you did that. But regardless, Frankenstein seems to be one of those movies that a lot of people have heard of, but not very many people have seen. And Frankenstein is a pretty iconic movie. It's got a lot of things that we immediately recognize, a lot of those references that are just a common part of our culture now. But I suspect that people think that they know it better than they actually do. Now, I'm filming this review well in advance, so I honestly don't know if I've actually uploaded the Books vs. Movies review of Frankenstein that is next on the Books vs. Movies review list, but if you have seen it, then you know that the movie Frankenstein has actually very little to do with the book Frankenstein, and actually the sequel to the movie Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, has more to do with Mary Shelley's novel than this movie does. And yet the movie still does contain a lot of the ideas from Mary Shelley's novel, even though they're not explicitly stated as such. Anyway, you look at it though, it's a classic piece of horror. It's influenced a lot of horror today. It was number 88 on the AFI Top 100 list, but they removed it for the revision, and we're going to look at it today to find out what's all the fuss about.
Do you follow me?
Not guilty.
Fight in here. This is
Shoot
the
your
war.
eye out, kid.
Why is the run gun serious?
It's moving. It's alive. It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. Oh, in the name of God. Now I know what it feels like to be God.
Dr. Henry Frankenstein has been behaving very strangely, cutting himself off from family and friends and even his fiancée, working on some mysterious project. Not satisfied with the ethical limitations at the laboratories of his school, Dr. Frankenstein has taken to digging up fresh corpses from graveyards, stealing brains from those same laboratories at his school, and conducting very dangerous experiments. All in an insane effort to stay the hand of death and create life. Like I said, we all know this story, even if you've never seen this movie or read the Mary Shelley novel. It's become one of the landmarks of our horror culture, everything from the insane cries of, "It's alive! It's alive!" to the flat-topped Boris Karloff monster. And just to be very clear, the monster, not Frankenstein. That's all. The idea behind this story took hold for a number of reasons. It's a fascinating, if somewhat sickening, thought. What if technology advanced to the point where we did have power over death? What would that mean? What would we do with such a power? Could that power potentially be dangerous? How would our society react to such a reanimated person? And would that reanimated person still be a person? Sadly, however, the movie doesn't have as much to do with these questions as it does with being a horror flick. Some of the questions are addressed, but for the most part, this movie is just your basic horror flick, and at the time, it was very effective as one. And I do like some aspects of the story. In particular, I love Boris Karloff's portrayal as the monster. He manages to express so much with absolutely no dialogue. I also like the fact that there's no musical score. Now, this might just be for budget reasons, but it does serve to make the tense moments a lot more tense, and in many ways more real. And there are many legitimately dark and frightening moments in this film, many of which were actually originally cut in the studio. Like Dr. Frankenstein proclaiming that he now knows what it's like to be God, or the actual drowning of the little girl by the monster. However, despite all of these positive aspects of the film, I don't think that it's aged terribly well. The film was obviously made in the days when people were still trying to figure out how to edit, and it does get a little tiresome after a while. And that's not really anything that the movie makers could help, and I fully understand that. But I also found the main character of Dr. Frankenstein to be a little tiresome. I'm really not crazy about melodrama unless it's being played up for comedic purposes, and Colin Clive is the king of melodrama in this movie. I mean, good God, Henry. lighten up. Even when he wasn't obsessed with his experiments, he was just so bloody pretentious. I think the only time he actually smiles in the whole movie is that manic grin that he gets when he realizes that his creation is alive. And okay, it's not a happy movie, I get that, but there was really nothing to convince me that this guy was worth rooting for. In many ways, the monster seemed more human to me than he did. Although, admittedly, that might be the point. So what's all the fuss about? I think that there are 2.5 things that make this movie fuss-worthy. The first is Karloff, who manages to convey all the themes from Mary Shelley's novel in his expressions. In Karloff's performance, we basically see someone who is a dangerous and innocent child. He expresses anger, fear, and delight absolutely beautifully, and he manages to convince us that this monster, even though he is very dangerous, is completely innocent and naive. Honestly, I almost feel like this movie would have worked better as a silent film given Karloff's silent performance. And yet for all that, his clumsy and unpredictable movements can make this character very frightening at times. He's a big guy and he has the mind of a criminal. We have absolutely no idea what he's gonna do next. In many ways, he's the most complex character in the entire movie, and we legitimately feel bad for him when he's trapped in that windmill fire. We even feel bad for him after he's realized that he has killed this little girl unintentionally. The second thing is the minor characters. Frankenstein is overly dramatic, Elizabeth and Victor have virtually no personality, but the minor characters in this film are actually done very, very well. Baron Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein's father, manages to be an actually pretty funny, blustering figure who still legitimately cares about his son. And even though he's only there for a short time, the catatonic way that the girl's father walks through town carrying the drowned body of his girl is absolutely heart-wrenching. And the other townsfolk very clearly illustrate the mob mentality that leads them to attacking something very different and strange. Goaded on by the death of this little girl, they don't even see the monster as human. They see it as a monster. They don't see any humanity in him, and even Frankenstein joins them in the end. This makes the fact that we as the audience can see the humanity in the monster that much stronger, and it manages to convey the ideas that Mary Shelley put forth in her novel without actually stating them. And the half thing is the imagery. The way that they put things together in this film is actually pretty good for the time. Not all of it is aged terribly well, but there are some pretty good moments that are legitimately scary. If you've ever done any kind of editing, then you can figure out how they did most of the tricks, but you have to remember the atmosphere that this was being watched in at the time. And in a darkened movie theater with the high contrast black and white and Edward von Sloan's cryptic warning still ringing in your ear, you can see how a lot of this would be pretty scary for first-time moviegoers. It didn't do a whole lot for me personally, mostly for the reasons that I listed before, but I'm willing to admit that I'm probably a little spoiled by modern-day filmmaking. I definitely think this movie is worth a watch, particularly if you want to see some of the roots of classic horror and some really, really solid sans dialogue acting. And I would most definitely encourage you to watch the film's sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein, which is also done incredibly well and actually did more for me than this movie. But it's difficult for me to take this movie entirely seriously due to the excessive melodrama and some of the cheesier effects. And I can see why it didn't make the cut the second time around for this list, but I do think that the fuss is definitely merited, and I would encourage you to give it a watch. On the worth meter, I'd give it a worth borrowing. Check it out if it interests you at all, and the next film on the list is going to be one of my all-time favorite films, 12 Angry Men. See you then. Dr. Frankenstein has taken to digging up bodies from graveyards, stealing brains from laboratories, and doing something else that's really, really not ethical, but I can't remember what it is right now. That's right, I did figure it out because the director is James Whale. Yes, that's right. Yes, okay. Sorry, just had a once upon a time moment.